In other wars, more people have died, more nations been involved, and the world brought closer to annihilation. But somehow the First World War retains a dread aura all of its own. The guns fell silent all those years ago, but like a refrain that stays with the audience long after the music stops, the First World War has a returning power. So monumental was the suffering, so far-reaching the influence on history, that the war still generates reward not just for writers, academics, and artists, but for people simply learning about themselves, their bloodlines, their place. The Great War's power lies with the suspicion that its impact has yet to be fully understood. I was born in Britain half a century after the fighting ended, yet the First World War has always been thereabouts, a background presence shaping me and my setting, a founding sequence in my makeup. Often it was so faint it was difficult to discern the whittling of one's own self through the loss of a distant ancestor. Occasionally it spiked. In my teens, sitting with my mother as she wept through the Festival of Remembrance televised each year from the Royal Albert Hall in London. But a war from 100 years ago remains relevant enough to intrude on our todays, through a sense that closure has perhaps yet to be reached. The moral clarity that framed the Second World War struggle against Nazi totalitarianism, or the Cold War's friction between right and left, seems to evade the earlier conflict. The question, was it right to go to war in 1914, can be answered, in many ways, through bullet points or lengthy treatises, but I wonder if any answer is totally convincing. This is what keeps the First World War so charged, the unease born of doubt as to whether the sacrifice was worthwhile. For me, this is what transforms so powerfully the words of Lawrence Binyon, plain enough by themselves, but, when delivered on a raw November morning to a gathering of people wearing red paper poppies, they ache from what might have been. We will remember them. In the small Northamptonshire village where I grew up, the First World War was remembered in glass. Helledon was too small to have shops, so the community revolved, as it had for centuries, around the church of St. John the Baptist, a modest but stolid place of worship, in keeping with the village's position at the middle of Middle England. Built of locally quarried ironstone, St. John's was chilly damp in winter, yet on summer nights the butterscotch masonry bled warmth from the day's baking in the sun. It was old enough to have known fighting. Indeed, my childish imagination was fired by stories about the runnels that flute the stone arch in the portico. I was told they'd been left by 17th century noblemen sharpening their swords before battle in the Civil War. As children, my friends and I would dare each other to climb the bell tower, and for years I earned pocket money mowing the grass in the graveyard. At the village carol service one year I fought my first trembling battle with stage fright when I was called on to read the Advent message from the Archangel Gabriel. A box had to be placed in the pulpit so I could see out as I wrestled with nerves and difficult words. The next generation of butchers would themselves pass through St. John's, with my firstborn niece being baptized there, while my own son would take snot-nosed delight in toddling up the lane to watch the bell ringers at practice. And each of these modest moments of a family's making were watched over by 4 figures, immortalized in a stained glass window that was set to catch the southern sun. Such windows are where biblical characters tend to be represented, but in the Helledon village church a group of decidedly unbiblical-looking male faces have stared out since their unveiling in 1920. Against a setting of rich green foliage and red petals, daylight can give the figures an authentically holy glow. They wear the pure silver armour of chivalrous medieval knights. Indeed, one is helmeted, but the other 3 have the pasted-down, centre-parted hairstyles of early 20th century England. They are portraits of the menfolk of the village who gave their lives in the First World War. 2 brothers, William and James Hedges, Fred Wells, and John Buchanan. It was this window that first brought me to think about the war, although my early grasp was childlike. Mostly I was interested in the sword that the helmeted figure leans on, and in the stirringly heroic words of the memorial's swirling epitaph, "The noble army of martyrs praise thee." These were men from my village, from my side. They died for us in a foreign place, in a cause that simply must have been noble. Now, back to the sword. Mine was not a military family, but as I grew older it was impossible to avoid the martial osmosis that steadily gives structure